This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the possibility of a defiant nuclear Iran is more real than ever. Russia agrees to sell Iran a powerful missile system, and a top violator of women's rights worldwide gets elected to protect women. Plus, making sure the world never forgets. We mark Holocaust Remembrance Day this week by bringing stories of love, hope, and resilience. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you this week from our Jerusalem studio. Iran's nuclear ambitions have become even more dangerous, thanks to Vladimir Putin. Russia announced plans to sell Iran a powerful missile system. The move would strengthen Iran's military abilities and could be used to protect Iran's nuclear program from an airstrike. It comes as the U.S. Senate wants to have its say on President Obama's deal with Iran. Here's Heather Sells with the story.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has lifted Russia's ban and approved the delivery of one of the most potent air defense weapons in the world to Iran. The S-300 missile system has a range of up to 125 miles and can track down and strike multiple targets simultaneously. We are convinced that at this stage there is no longer need for such an embargo. Both the U.S. and Israel object to the sale of the missiles. The concern is that they would protect Iran's nuclear facilities from an air attack and give it cover to develop nuclear weapons. A Wall Street Journal editorial says the Kremlin is offering the mullahs an air defense capability so sophisticated that it would render Iran's nuclear installations far more difficult and costly to attack. Russia maintains that Iran badly needs the system because of tensions in the region, including in Yemen, and insists it does not threaten Israel or other countries. The S-300 is exclusively a defensive weapon, which cannot serve offensive purposes and will not jeopardize the security of any country, including, of course, Israel. Russia's move comes as Congress is directly challenging the White House over the proposed nuclear deal. The Senate is considering a bill that would give Congress the last say over any final nuclear agreement with Iran.
At least after 2.5 years of negotiations, the Congress should have 60 days to be able to review probably the most significant nuclear nonproliferation agreement of our time.
A Senate committee vote on the bill is likely today. The Iranian nuclear deal is supposed to be finalized by June 30th. Heather Sells, CBN News.
In addition to American politicians and critics, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is still raising red flags over the Iranian nuclear agreement. He said the U.S. and its allies can get a better deal.
Instead of allowing Iran to preserve and develop its nuclear capabilities, a better deal would significantly roll back these capabilities. For example, by shutting down the illicit underground facilities that Iran concealed for years from the international community.
Meanwhile, Netanyahu is getting support from a Middle East neighbor. Egyptian TV presenter Tawfiq Okasha is calling on Netanyahu to bomb Iran. Okasha called the prime minister a dear friend and said, quote, "Put your trust in God and bomb it." That's a big switch for Egypt's media. For decades, it's been extremely hostile towards Israel. And one of the things bringing Egypt and Israel together is their common enemy, Iran. Iran's influence in the region is growing, and it's at the center of conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Despite these conflicts and its record of human rights abuses, Iran was elected to serve on a UN agency committed to preserving women's rights. We talked with Hillel Noor, the executive director of UN Watch, about this development and how the United Nations, at least to many, seems like a world upside down. Hillel, Iran was voted to the UN board to oversee women's rights. What was your reaction to this?
It's an outrage. You know, Iran just 6 months ago was condemned by the United Nations General Assembly for pervasive gender inequality, violence against women, and discrimination in law and in practice against women and girls. It's one of the worst countries in the world on women's rights. In fact, the global gender gap of the World Economic Forum rated Iran one of the worst countries in the world, almost really at the bottom. It's an outrage. Electing Iran to the UN Agency for Women's Equality and Empowerment is like making a pyromaniac into the town fire chief.
How can you explain the fact that many nations voted to put Iran on this
The
board?
logical thing to do would be to choose countries that have a decent record, have a good record on women's equality and empowerment, not one country that's one of the worst countries. Sadly, the United Nations doesn't work the way it's supposed to in many cases. We have a similar situation at the Human Rights Council, where tyrannies like China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia were recently elected members, again, contrary to the established criteria of those bodies. In 2010, the United States led the way in finding an alternative candidate so that Iran wouldn't win. When Iran tried the same thing back in 2010, they found a small country, Timor-Leste, which on its own couldn't have won, but America campaigned for them and managed to defeat Iran. This time, neither America nor Europe did any effort to find an alternative candidate, and that's why Iran won. And we're concerned that the US and the EU chose inaction because of the nuclear talks, not to upset the so-called nuclear deal that they have with Iran.
Now, you wrote a letter to the UN Secretary General. Any reaction to that letter?
No response yet, and we're disturbed. The Secretary General is someone who should be a moral leader, and even if things happen at the United Nations, he can. In previous situations, other UN officials, the Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, who's not normally someone who takes principled stands in so many things, but when the Syria's Assad regime was elected to their Human Rights Committee a few years ago, she did say that this was inappropriate. And so we think there's precedent for Ban Ki-moon to say that the election of Iran, a country that arrests women if their head covering isn't strict enough, which allows acid attacks against women, where there's spousal abuse that seems to be legitimized by the government. We think it's outrageous, and the Secretary General needs to speak out.
Did you have any reaction from women's groups that about this vote?
It's a good question. They ought to be the first really to speak out. And I think there have been some of the leading groups. I haven't heard something, and I think there is a certain misguided political correctness that's in play here, where some women's rights groups are afraid to criticize Islamist practices for fear of being perceived as Islamophobic or racist. And I think it's wrong, because Iranian women are the first to speak out.
Yeah, you talked about the nuclear negotiations with Iran. What impact has that had on Iran's sort of standing there at the United Nations?
Well, I think it seems to be now that they're getting a kind of immunity. Iran has tried for a number of years to be elected to UN bodies. They did try to be elected to the Human Rights Council, and our group, UN Watch, exposed that about a year and a half ago. And America immediately condemned their candidacy, and they withdrew. But now they were able to do now what they weren't able to do 5 years ago, and I think that this Iran deal gives them the impression of being reasonable. The West now feels that it can't do anything to upset their apple cart.
You know, some people look at the UN, they look at a vote like this, and they almost see like this is the world turned upside down. How would you describe what happens there at the United Nations? You've been there for many years.
Yeah, well, I think what you said is a perfect description. It is a world turned upside down. Every time I walk into the UN Human Rights Council, which was founded by incredible idealists like Eleanor Roosevelt, was the founding chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights, the great humanitarian of her age. And to see today having members like China, Russia, Cuba, Pakistan, Venezuela, it's outrageous. So every time I walk in there, I remind myself that I am walking into an Orwellian institution where human rights have been turned upside down, and that it's an alternate reality. And we go in there to try and speak truth to power, and that's why I'm the most hated man in Geneva.
Can you describe what kind of treatment Israel gets in the United Nations?
Israel gets a treatment that no other country gets. At every session of the Human Rights Council, for example, there's a day on Israel, just like there's a day on human rights situations around the world, and then there's one day just for Israel. It's a special agenda item only to criticize so-called Israeli violations. There's no agenda item for genocide that happened in Darfur and Sudan. There's no agenda item for Syria, where 200,000 to 300,000 people have been killed, millions have been displaced, barrel bombs are being dropped on children, nor on North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet for human rights. Only Israel, the Jewish state, gets its own agenda item. And if you look at the number of resolutions, Israel is typically condemned in half the resolutions at the Human Rights Council. The expert on Israel looks only at Israeli violations, which are presumed in advance, and won't look at any Palestinian action. So if there's, God forbid, a suicide bombing in Israel, the expert will criticize Israel's response when it goes to try to find and arrest the terrorists, but it won't criticize a suicide bombing because that's a Palestinian action, which is not in his mandate to examine it. So it's really a very distinctive treatment that is designed to create a narrative as Israel as some sort of wicked human rights abuser.
What is it like for you?
It's not pleasant to be in an assembly where you know that many of the people in front of you in the room despise you for critiquing the UN when they do things that are against their own principles, for taking on tyrannies that have seats of power and influence there. It's not pleasant, but we get support around the world, and we know that we're doing the right thing, and we're going to continue speaking out.
Well, thank you for the work you do, and thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Coming up, 2 U.S. congressmen tell us why they're concerned about the future of the Israeli-U.S. relationship. For decades, the U.S. has been Israel's closest ally. But could that be changing in the shadow of the Iran controversy? On a recent visit to the Middle East, 2 U.S. congressmen said they're troubled by the direction of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Israel and the United States have enjoyed a very close relationship going back to the creation of the Jewish state. Even friendships go through rough patches, and that's happened the past few months regarding Iran. In a region where radical Islam looks to seize power from longtime dictators, Israel is the sole democracy. On the front lines of the war against terrorism, it's also a leader in the world of high-tech and medical advances.
I'm concerned that we as Americans don't truly appreciate or understand, and therefore don't appreciate, how significant Israel is not only to our survival as a country, but also to the survival of the free world, especially here in the Mideast.
During a trip to Israel, U.S. Congressmen Dennis Ross and Robert Pittenger visited Judea and Samaria to learn more about how the country protects its people and way of life.
They have been our surrogate fighting the terrorists. We've helped contribute to the Iron Dome, which is a missile defense system that they've developed.
Their comments come at a time of unprecedented friction between U.S. and Israeli leadership over the issue of a nuclear Iran.
The Prime Minister is the Winston Churchill of our era, and regrettably, President Obama is the Neville Chamberlain. He doesn't see the facts. He doesn't see the issues.
Pittenger said he was disturbed that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared unsure of U.S. help in their time of trouble.
Frankly, I asked the Prime Minister, at such time that you believe that you will need America, will you believe America will be there for you? And the best answer he could give me was, I hope so.
Other longtime U.S. allies like Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates are looking to Israel for help in fighting radical Islamic groups.
Who came in to help Egypt? It wasn't us, it was Israel. Israel has been the best partner that President Sisi has had to defeat the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel has as well been given significant strategic assistance to Jordan.
The congressman also agreed the U.S. could learn a lot from Israel.
We don't understand what a resilient country that this is. Under enormous pressure and challenge from its borders, in the midst of that, they're one of the strongest entrepreneurial economies in the world.
We can learn a lot about not only their commitment with the young people going into the IDF and having public service, we can learn a lot from their opportunities for economic development, we can learn a lot from their agricultural skills that they've honed and turned a desert into a very vibrant and successful agricultural arena.
Up next, 2 stories from the Holocaust of survival and miracles. The concerns about another Holocaust are real in Israel today. 46% of Israelis believe a Holocaust could happen again, according to a survey by the Foundation for the Benefit of Holocaust Victims. Nearly half of the survivors also think the Holocaust will be forgotten in the future. That survey coincides with Holocaust Remembrance Week, 70 years after the Allies opened the Nazi death camps and discovered 6 million Jewish dead. Fewer than 200,000 survivors are alive today. But as John Wagi explains, Israelis are working hard to keep their memory alive.
It's difficult to grasp the horror and destruction of the Nazi killing machine. 1/3 of the world's Jews were murdered. The pain and scars endure to the next generations. David Hershkovitz would hear his mother screaming in her sleep as she relived the agony A German soldier separated her from her own mother, who died at Auschwitz.
She didn't speak about the gas chambers because she wasn't there. She didn't speak about the fact that they were burning bodies. She wasn't there. But during the separation, she was there, and the separation didn't leave her.
Hershkowitz's mother died 2 years ago, but through a second-generation study course in Central Israel, he's keeping her story alive. The Shem Olam Holocaust Institute is educating people like Hershkowitz to tell their stories when the Holocaust survivors are gone. The Institute's director, Avram Krieger, says many children didn't ask tough questions of their parents.
How did the parents deal with guilt questions during those moments? How did they go through the difficult moments of separation, of leaving, of difficult decisions? They weren't able to ask this, and apparently the parents weren't able to answer.
Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum tells more stories in an exhibition called Children in the Holocaust, Stars Without a Heaven, with dolls and sketches. Ina Renat Rahavi's teddy bear is on display. She carried the bear during a remarkable escape with her mother from the train car leading them to Auschwitz.
Teddy lasted better than I did, and many others. He is more war-wounded than I am since he is missing an ear and an arm, but he was a real hero.
John Wagi, CBN News.
Another Holocaust survivor, Rita Kazamal Brown, told us her story of survival and miracles.
This painting is a recent one. I named it The Wounded Survivor.
Rita Kazamal Brown was 7 years old when the Nazis invaded her hometown of Termot in Poland. In 1941, Nazis rounded up the Jews there and put them in a ghetto. Rita is now a recognized Holocaust artist who has worked as an art therapist. Her survival experience is the theme of many of her paintings.
I'm the wounded survivor. I always painted myself in white. I think it has to do with not so white nightgown that I survived the whole Holocaust in.
At 80, Rita is bubbly and vibrant. If not for her artwork and her story, you might never know her painful past. Yet she carries her memories with her every day.
I'm not sure if it's totally that you cannot heal the wound. It's something that still works in your memory, and it affects your daily life.
Her story is told in the book Portrait of a Holocaust Child, Memories and Reflections. Rita told CBN News how she and her family escaped the ghetto and survived in what they called the grub.
And my father went away for a few days, and what he did, he found another Christian family in a little town called Malaki. And there he dug a big pit under the stable, and it had a connection to the potato bin and a ledge you can open to the farmer's home. My father and my mother and the two little kids were with them, and only my little brother could stand up. And I was lying in the passageway from the pit to the potato bin. This is how we lived 20 months. We were hungry and fearful, and it was just a living hell. We called it, it was a living grave.
Being awake was a nightmare, she said, hour by hour, suffering day and night. Most of her father's 12 siblings died, where her little family of 5 stayed alive.
Being creative helped me survive, but not only survive, but keep my sanity.
In 2006, Rita revisited Poland for the first time to join the March of the Living. While there at Auschwitz, a spider bite took special significance.
And there is this black spider that bit me, and it looks a little bit like a swastika. Yeah. And it's also soaked with blood.
A mother of 2 and grandmother of 3, she's seen many miracles in her life.
We have kind of a survival instinct, which was very strong, but now it's weakening because when you get older, your defenses go down. And so the only thing that we have is because of our children and grandchildren. That's our victory.
Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, see how one Holocaust survivor found the help she needed. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Many Holocaust survivors struggle to make ends meet, and many live below the poverty line. So purchasing a new stove can be out of the reach for some budgets. That's why it was so special when Operation Blessing Israel came to the aid of this Holocaust survivor.
Elizabeth Tishman is one of about 200,000 Holocaust survivors living in Israel. She was only 11 years old when the horror of the Holocaust began to unfold in her native Russia. Nazis forced her neighbors into ghettos. To avoid capture, her family took refuge in a friend's basement. In the darkness, she witnessed terrible tragedies.
There was a little child with his mother, and he cried a lot. She suffocated him with her bare hands to keep us all from getting caught and killed.
When they had to abandon their hiding place, they were eventually forced to live in the ghetto.
Do you know what is it like to lay on straw when it is raining and you don't have a blanket to cover yourself? Or when a Nazi officer comes at night to search your house? It is a nightmare.
After 3 torturous years, news came that the war was finally over.
People ran into the streets shouting, "We're free!" We all cried and laughed and hugged each other. It was incredible.
Today, like many Holocaust survivors in Israel, Elizabeth lives in poverty.
When I first came here, I had only cucumbers, tomatoes, and bread and butter.
CBN Israel helps Holocaust survivors by taking groceries to them each month. Elizabeth says she looks forward to every visit.
I like when they come, and I like that they believe in God. If God led me through this life, and you have come to see me, that means that God has not forgotten me.
Recently, Elizabeth's gas stove started to leak. She didn't have the money to fix it and had no way to cook. So we took her shopping and bought her a new stove.
I want to thank you so much for your help. May God bless you and give you health and happiness.
Finally this week, every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day, a siren wails over the Jewish state. Israelis all over the country stop for 2 minutes and remember those who perished in what they call in Hebrew the Shoah. Here's what it looks like and sounds like on the streets of Jerusalem. It's a reminder of the cry that rose from the ashes of the Holocaust, never again. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.